death in our archaeological record is one of those crazy mirrors in a funhouse. It's going to distort everything. And you still see the picture, but you're not really quite sure what's true anymore.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionist podcast. Today, I am joined by Nicholas Ahern. Nicholas has a BA in Classics and Classical Literature from the University of Warwick. He's done his Master's in Classics, Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies and Archaeology at the University of Oxford. He is currently undertaking his PhD on sarcophagi and funerary customs of Roman Phoenicia at the University of Oregon. And he has previously had many amazing work opportunities, such as the Waterford Museum of Treasures, the Knossos Research Centre, and Pompeii, to name but a few. So welcome to the show, Nicholas.
Thank you for having me.
You have a very interesting and long career path on LinkedIn. I was doing a bit of cyber stalking before we got started. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most as an Irish person is that you worked at the Waterford Museum of Treasures.
Yeah. So I knew at that stage, it was in my leaving cert, so the equivalent of A-levels in the UK, that I wanted to go into history or archaeology of some sort at university. So I looked for a local opportunity and did a sort of internship there for 9 months. So I helped transcribe some documents, which were mostly in English, a little bit of Irish. Luckily, I didn't have to do too much Irish. And then helped organize a curatorial exhibition. They were launching a new commemorative exhibition to do with Irish history in the 1900s. But it was modern history, so it wasn't proper archaeology at that point.
Well, it's still really interesting and really kind of, I can't think of the word, going out there before you've even started college and being like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to get experience in it. It's not something I feel like a lot of leaving cert kids think to do. They're just like, yeah, I'll go to college and then find a job afterwards and it'll be fine.
Yeah, well, I felt like it was something I had to do because I was applying for classics and archaeology, and we don't have those sorts of options in leaving cert. The closest we have is history, whereas my peers who were in the UK would have obviously taken some sort of class in classical languages or classical civilization.
Yeah. So I've noticed as well, in my cyber stalking, that a lot of your work experience, it has been around the classical world. You've worked in Knossos, you've worked in Pompeii, which is so impressive to me. So obviously with your degree and stuff as well, you have an interest in the classical world. Do you know where that came from, or can you talk about how you kind of developed that?
Sure, I think a lot of people who are into archaeology, my interest in the past started with geology and paleontology, and I can say that I'm still very interested and excited by dinosaurs. But the first material evidence of the human past that really caught my imagination was Egyptology. No surprise there as well. But it wasn't, like I said, I didn't have a background in classics, and I actually got into classics sort of by accident because I signed up for this BA in classical archaeology, oblivious to the fact that classics just meant Greece and Rome, and I thought I would be studying Egypt. And
I feel like that is a common mistake.
Yeah, I wasn't happy at all for the first year, but I had amazing professors and teachers at Warwick who made it so interesting and ignited a new passion in me for classics. So yeah, and then it was easy to remain interested and find my own route.
So you are currently studying funerary archaeology, or funerary past information regarding funerals. Is that something you were always interested in, or has that developed through your sort of career and your education?
Definitely developed through my BA and masters. So, we often in lectures and papers draw upon funerary material because it's so well preserved and it offers a range of different objects that can grant some really unique insights into life and death of the ancient world. So throughout all my lectures at Warwick during my BA, there was always some sort of funerary evidence, usually funerary monuments in Rome, some sarcophagi that popped up. But it wasn't really until my master's that I discovered my love for sarcophagi. So it was my final term at Oxford, and we had a tutorial which was framed around the question, what dictates the representation of Greek myths on Roman sarcophagi? And until that point, I'd been focusing mostly on iconography or visual culture. That's my specialism at the moment. And most of the art or visual culture I'd been looking at was state monuments erected as propaganda or celebrations of state victories. And for the first time, I was analyzing such intimate, personal material like I'd never done before. And there's been a lot of really interesting scholarship the last 3 or 4 decades that have studied the emotional capacities of sarcophagi. So scholars have been theorizing how sarcophagi iconographies could have consoled mourners through their grief, and simultaneously both brought them closer to the deceased and also distanced them safely so that they could go on this new journey of separation. So that was just something that amazed me so much, and I thought it was really important to use this as an opportunity to really humanize the Romans or the inhabitants of the Roman Empire that we're studying. And in such an intimate way, it was really easy to relate to them and see similarities between them and us. And I also knew I wanted to, for my PhD, study on the Roman East. And then I knew that my current supervisor, Professor Liederweide de Jong at the University of Groningen, she's one of the people to supervise a topic like that. So I'm very happy to be under her supervision studying sarcophagi of Roman Phoenicia at the moment.
Yes. So your PhD is entitled In Coffin Bodies on the Role of Sarcophagi in the Funerary Customs of Roman Period Phoenicia. So could you give us maybe a brief introduction into what Roman Phoenicia looked like, especially in comparison to like the Rome that we think of when we think of ancient Rome?
Sure. So Phoenicia refers to the region that's more or less present-day Lebanon. This is where most of my data to sarcophagi come from. Although it's pretty difficult to project this modern nation state onto an ancient geographical region because the geopolitical limits of Phoenicia were constantly in a state of flux throughout ancient history. And Phoenicia had a long history before Rome conquered the region. It was known for its raw industries. It was known for its merchants and sailors, colonists. They founded lots of colonies in the Mediterranean, so always had these strong connections with the regions slightly further west in the Mediterranean. Before Rome came to Phoenicia, Phoenicia had already been conquered by the Persians. It had been conquered by the Greco-Macedonians. So it had a lot of strong trade networks, opportunities to exchange gifts and other material objects with the Greeks of the world. And of course, during its Greco-Macedonian conquest, there would have been some Greek or Macedonian settlers in the region, so the ethnicities and the cultures would have been developing over a long period of time. And then in 64 BC, when Pompey the Great and Rome officially annexed Phoenicia as part of a larger province called Syria, it would have experienced some Roman immigrants, so soldiers of some sort. They would have settled in Berytus, which is now modern day Beirut. And in terms of how the landscape changed, it took a little time for for us to see influences of Rome in the archaeological record. So it's really later in the 1st century BC and AD that we see a lot of building programs and infrastructure appearing in Phoenicia under Rome. So, very similar monuments and road systems to what we see further west in the empire. And then it's not until the 2nd or 3rd century AD that sarcophagi start really popping up on an unprecedented scale. So it's very similar to the sarcophagus habit at large that was occurring in the empire at that time.
Okay. And could you, for anyone who maybe isn't familiar, kind of explain what a sarcophagus is, why or how they were decorated, like what kind of decorations were on them and stuff as well?
Sure. So ancient sarcophagi are the equivalent to more or less modern coffins or caskets. They were containers that contained, protected the deceased and their body, and also communicated with the living. So they were a material and visual means of representing the dead as well. They usually comprise two components, the chest and the lid, which are separate or detachable. The lid could also be secured fast using a sort of lime plaster or metal cramps, especially in later periods. I actually get this question quite a lot from people who are usually researchers, not of the ancient world or just members of the public, because I think a lot of people, when they first hear the word sarcophagus, they immediately think of the Egyptian sarcophagi of the dynastic pharaohs. So these beautiful gilded, colorful sarcophagi that are sort of like Russian dolls, right? You've got all these coffins and more inner layers inside, and eventually you get to the pharaoh's body. And we can touch on that later. Sometimes in the Roman sarcophagus habit, you have a similar thing whereby sarcophagi of lead, terracotta, and wood can be found within each other and also within stone sarcophagi. But the Roman sarcophagi of the empire, they're quite diverse actually. So their production and consumption started around the death of the Emperor Hadrian. He died in AD 136, and that's really when we see sarcophagus desires to use sarcophagi for the dead taking off in Rome and also across the empire. We also think this is linked to the desire for inhumation burials. So there were periods of time in Rome and the empire where people would favor inhumation or cremation, but they weren't always mutually exclusive. So you could have the two coexisting as well. Our word sarcophagus comes from the Latin word sarcophagus or the Greek sarcophagus, which literally means flesh eater. And we have a literary source from Pliny the Elder writing in the 1st century AD, and he talks about this special type of stone that's used in a place called the Troad in Turkey. And this is where the word flesh eater comes from. So he calls it flesh-eating material. And this reflects some sort of belief, it seems, amongst Romans or amongst Greeks and Romans, that this stone was capable of consuming the flesh and helping the decomposition process, and that the stone was favored for that reason. There have actually been recent scientific studies that do not prove this, so we think that this sort of stone actually could have slowed down decomposition. Also, We have evidence, archaeological and literary, again from Pliny the Elder, that you could deposit lime inside these sorts of sarcophagi that could also literally petrify the body, so the stone would attach itself to the body, especially augmented when the lime was interacting with all the bodily juices stored inside the sarcophagi. So regardless of whether sarcophagi actually had this flesh-eating property, it still reflects that decomposition and the treatment of the body was integral to Roman funerary customs, but also that the sarcophagus itself as an object and as a type of tomb was very special to these values. And as I said, they can look very diverse. Most of the ones that are well known are made of various types of stone. Some can be decorated, some aren't. They can have inscriptions as well. And we have plenty of time to go into a little bit more detail about those aspects.
So, yes, your project is studying sarcophagi, but in sort of what way are you studying them, or what are you trying to uncover, I guess, through this study of specifically Roman period Phoenician sarcophagi?
Yeah, so as you said, the beginning of my thesis title is called Encoffined Bodies. And this is really important because it's putting the body at the center of the sarcophagus studies. So we have a long history of studying sarcophagi amongst scholars of the classical world. And of course, a lot of the focus has been on Rome. It's been really well excavated, or even if it's not always well documented. So we lose a lot of contextual information from our evidence in Rome. And like I did in my master's, it was the Greek myths ornately decorating the sarcophagi that captured a lot of the scholars and connoisseurs' attention, and they've received significant disproportionate attention in terms of, like, compared to the fact that they actually composed such a small proportion of the sarcophagi across the empire. And when I was studying the sarcophagi in my master's tutorial, we were all studying images of the sarcophagi in a two-dimensional way. So they were flat photos of the front long panels, and often these panels were isolated. So we'd lost the short sides and the back. We'd lost the lid sometimes. We had very little contextual information, even though I already mentioned that there were all these exciting theoretical approaches to reading the imagery and unlocking the meanings. And I started to question how much our questions and answers about the sarcophagi would change if we did have that contextual information. If we had all the sides of the sarcophagi and we tried to reconstruct how an ancient person actually would have viewed this three-dimensional object, how they would have walked around it, how they would have sensed it, so how they would have touched it as well. If it was in a tomb complex underground or some sort of interior tomb building and they were using lamps or torches to light their way, how different did it look? How different was that experience when they were using lamps? And, lamps were a common grave good or offering to the dead, but we seldom have let's say the artistic element, the iconographies of the sarcophagi and the archaeological context, the tomb space, and these grave goods together. So I was really frustrated by this. And it's not the reason I went to Knossos in Crete to do an internship there. That's actually because I did my BA thesis on Minoan Crete, so millennia earlier. But when I was in we call it the strat, the cataloging house and the storage house in Knossos, I had so many grave goods and possessions and objects from the Roman tombs in Crete. And they were so exciting. It was really nice finally to see the other side of it, not the sarcophagi, but the objects inside and around them. But unfortunately, Crete has yielded very few decorated Roman sarcophagi. So I felt like I'd gotten the other side of the coin, but was still struggling to reconcile these two, the artistic and the archaeological evidence, which frustrated me even more. So that was really important to me, and that's central to my research at the moment. And I'm really happy that my supervisor, Ludovita de Jong, and her project allows me to reconcile these two approaches, and to one of my aims is to reconstruct funerary customs, values, and beliefs. And we can talk a little bit about that later. Beliefs are a lot more hard to pin down. And the two ways in which I do this basically is quantitative and qualitative together. So the quantitative consists of collecting about, well, at first it was meant to be about 300 or 400 sarcophagi, but I keep expanding my data set, and it's probably going to end up a bit more like 1,500. And then I will do statistical analysis on those to see regional patterns, and as much as I can to see how similar what is going on in Phoenicia is to elsewhere in the empire. And then the qualitative part for me is really where the magic happens. It can be a little bit too theoretical for some people, but I'll have that statistical analysis to back me up. And that's where I try to reconstruct how the sarcophagi would have shaped how viewers felt, thought, and acted in funerary ritual.
So yeah, you're talking there about how, how people are learning about how people would have interacted with these sarcophagi and how they would have interpreted the motifs that are on them. So do we have, so far in your research or just in general, do we have any information on kind of how the funerary ritual would have taken place back then? Like how these sarcophagi would have been presented to people, or in what way would they have been sort of interacting with them?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have that many literary sources rooted in my region. Some of them I still have to access, and others I can't because they're not in Latin and Greek. They're in an Eastern Aramaic script, so that's a whole different thesis. And you always have this problem when you're studying peripheral regions, like Phoenicia being on the edge of the empire in the east. How similar were funerary practices to Rome, and how far can we use the literary sources and all the inscriptions in Rome and that sort of area that tell us more about the sarcophagi and how they were used. So the sarcophagi in Rome are mostly inside tomb buildings. There are actually also a lot more sarcophagi in Rome completely buried, so just dug into pits and buried, more than we originally thought. But when you move further east into Greece, Turkey, Phoenicia, and Syria, sarcophagi start to be displayed outdoors instead. So in Phoenicia, most of the sarcophagi are displayed in open air funerary enclosures, which are basically just in walled areas. And over time, more walls would have been added. So I really think at first, the most prominent ones could have been, the earliest ones could have been very prominent and visible to people. And these sorts of necropolis or cemeteries were lining the roads. So some of them would have been very visible to passers-by. But the more sarcophagi that were added over time, the less visible they became because they were impeding each other's views. As I said, lots of walls and new structures were built over time. And really interestingly, in these cemeteries, the funerary enclosures in late antiquity, so from the 4th to the 7th century AD, when Christianity was dominant, they started building chapels and churches within the cemetery. So you'd have people also visiting the church and going to pray who may have been interacting with the sarcophagi. So it's not just loved ones and ritual practitioners helping with the funerals, but it's also passers-by and people doing other things. There were also gardens sometimes in these funerary enclosures. So sometimes they may also have been near social spots where people were just talking and spending time with each other. There are some sarcophagi from underground tombs as well. and I've done a little bit of research about this as well. The sort of experience and how different it is going into this dark, much colder place, using lamps, and how it would be a lot more difficult to navigate the space as well. In terms of how people actually interacted with them in the funeral, most of them probably would have been shipped in and put in place before the funeral. It's possible sometimes that you could order a plainer sarcophagus at short notice and it would be finished in time. Some people have used temporary coffins, like made of wood or terracotta, and then later they can be placed into their stone sarcophagus. But I think a lot of them would have been pre-designed. So the commissioner either would have bought quite a sarcophagus design that was quite popular at the time, and so it didn't take too long to make. Maybe they could just walk into a workshop and say, I want one of those standard generic ones. But we've also moved recently to recognizing a lot more individuality in commissioners designing their sarcophagus, and increased communication between the commissioners or patrons and the workshops. So there's actually a lot more individualization and personalization to investigate. It's also possible that when you would have these sarcophagi shipped in from elsewhere, say Greece or Turkey, Turkey is my main importer for my sarcophagi in Phoenicia. They could be put in place in the cemetery, and then little details could be added by a local sculptor. So I think that the sarcophagus would have been in place in most cases, and at least the deceased before they died or the loved ones would have known what the sarcophagus looked like, and they already would have been interacting with the iconography. But really, it's during the funeral and subsequent funerary rites that I'm really focusing on. We have some insights to what funerals would look like in Roman Phoenicia from Lucian, the satirist. So he was writing in the 2nd century AD, the same century that these sarcophagi started being used. Because he writes satire, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, so not believe everything he's saying. And of course, if he's an elite male, his views are not necessarily representative of society, but it's nice that he's Greco-Syrian, and it's a change from all our sources that are usually from Rome or Greece. And he talks a lot about customs of mourners. He talks about offerings that have to be made at tombs, so pouring libations, some sort of liquid offering, usually assumed to be wine. I also have an inscription further east in Syria that mentions that, on a tomb, that mentions that the descendants are expected to bring flowers to the grave and also give some sort of wine offerings. Lucian also mentions that a coin is to be given to the dead, often in the mouth or the hand, which is meant to pay Chiron the ferryman, so that it will help the deceased get to Hades. I have many coins in my sarcophagi, but because archaeologists who were excavating didn't record the exact find spots, and many of my sarcophagi were disturbed by looters looking for treasures, I can't say where the coins were actually placed, but they could have had this purpose amongst other symbolic or practical functions in the grave. So Lucian also tells us about rites similar to Rome. So the corpse is washed and anointed with perfumes and flowers. I have a lot of vegetative decoration in my sarcophagi and also tombs. So this is also something I talk about from a sensorial point of view, that being surrounded by all this vegetative imagery is going to somewhat alleviate or counter, the horrible smells of death and the darker side of those experiences. And I do have a few sarcophagi that also refer to this sort of treatment of the corpse. So I'll have mythological scenes decorating the chests, and you can see bodies are laid out and they're about to be cleaned and dressed, or they're not being cleaned and dressed. So when viewers were faced with these sorts of images, I'm questioning how much were they contemplating these scenes? How much were these scenes meant to be teaching them, remember to pay proper funerary rites to the deceased? Either they will see these scenes directly, or they will look at this corpse that is not receiving them, and they will feel the need to honor similar corpses in that way. Similar to many of our Greek and Roman sources, Lucian also talks about women wailing and mourning. Men and women are mourners, but particularly the women seem to take the most public role. This may also be seen in my sarcophagi. I'm still in the process of collecting them, but what I've noticed is whenever I have a mourning figure or a figure that looks extremely sad, usually outside of myth, so standalone figures, it's always a female figure. So I know I'm not doing well to counter the gender stereotypes. And Valerie Hope has just released a book this year on mourners in mostly Rome. She actually says that we may have over exaggerated very well that it was the women doing all the mourning, because she's analyzed images of both women and men who are mourning. But what's going on in the East in my sarcophagi obviously says something else. It's always difficult when you have an image like that to know how much that image is actually reflecting real life versus it's just displaying a social ideal that people should live up to. But it's nice to at least see some patterns with the literary sources. He also talks about, as well as mourners, he talks about ritual practitioners carrying the corpse to the graveside. And I don't have any images of this, but I do have a couple of inscriptions, late antique inscriptions, probably the 5th and 6th century AD, that mention stretcher bearers, or the lecticari in Latin. So these are the people who were professionals who were responsible for carrying the corpse. And one of the inscriptions is really funny because it calls upon an immortal god, possibly our Christian god, but it could be a god at the time. And he says, the inscription says that only God will know the remains of the 20 or so people that are buried here. No one else is going to know, not even the stretcher bearers, because it was their fault what happened. And he's damning these stretcher bearers. So I have no idea what happened. I don't know if they dropped the body or they got the wrong body in the wrong sarcophagus, but it's a really funny inscription that, the sort of real life experiences that you just don't get from those elite men writing literary sources most of the time. And as I mentioned, a lot of offerings then are given to the dead. This could have been done earlier in the home, or it could be done once the body is laid to rest in the sarcophagus. So I have a lot of lamps and coins that I mentioned. And finally, Lucian gets to the last part of the funeral, which he calls an absurdity because he's taking the mick out of all these mourners and their customs. And that's the feast with the dead. So we have many sources from Roman Greece that talk about loved ones reclining around the sarcophagus or the tomb and having food and drink with the dead, especially on public festivals like the Parentalia. And we do have archaeological evidence in Rome and some other places of the remains of couches and their formations. Unfortunately, we have none of these from Phoenicia and Syria. But I already mentioned that, we do have this inscription from Syria that mentions wine, and some of my sarcophagi have on the lids, they have these 3-dimensional, more or less life-size portraits, and they're reclining on a couch. So when you are a loved one going, I think that would definitely resonate with you, that it looks like they're ready to dine with you. And so the deceased materially and visually could have been included in that sort of way. Of course, this is only the much more expensive sarcophagi that had this three-dimensional portrait on top. But it's definitely something to think about. And something else I've also thought about is, because these are very expensive sarcophagi with the portraits, these deceased individuals would have had slaves and servants. So I've thought about a slave or a servant bringing food and wine offerings to the dead, and their embodied experience of doing that at the graveside would look exactly how their life did when they were serving their masters when they were alive, because the deceased is in the exact same position. But yeah, so it's a mixture of, it's something I actually need to think about putting in my thesis. Actually, it's a good question you ask. Reconstructing the funeral with the literary sources that we have, and then trying to relate that to my sarcophagi. So thanks for that contribution.
No problem. I think it's really interesting you saying how like they would have commissioned some of these sarcophagi like while the people were still alive, so they would have had an input into what they look like. Because usually, like me as an osteologist, when they're teaching us about funerary rites, they're like, remember, it's the living that are hosting the funeral, like putting in the grave goods. Like it's them that's actually determining how this individual is seen. And it might not necessarily fully reflect how they saw themselves or how society as a whole saw them when they were alive. But I suppose in this instance, at the very least, it's the individual themselves has some agency in what their sarcophagus look like, or what their 3D sort of lid part of themselves look like as well in the very expensive ones.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, and you have to really base it on an individual case. We do have some inscriptions from sarcophagi, but also many tombs elsewhere. Like take Rome, for example, that will say vivi facerant. So the people who set up the monument did it whilst they were alive. You can also get a husband or a wife commissioning a monument to their deceased partner and themselves when they're going to die. I don't have any of these sorts of inscriptions, so I can't say for certain who actually commissioned it. So this is going to, I guess I'm going to have to work with a lot of scenarios. Who was actually designing these. But as I said, recently in Roman sarcophagi studies, we've moved to a much higher degree of individualization. And there are, quite a few sarcophagi off the top of my head in my data set that look highly personalized. And I think that would have been the deceased before they died having a significant input.
It's just interesting to think about, the how much agency maybe somebody had in, their own sort of funeral, especially when they are seen to be a part of it with this feast at the end as well. That, if anyone did have any sort of agency in how the whole thing looked, and then they're sort of feasting with them at the end as well. It's a nice little bringing the whole thing together, I guess.
Yeah, it's nice that they would have agency in those scenarios.
Yes. So you mentioned previously about sort of beliefs and what we might be able to interpret around sort of the Phoenicians or the Romans' belief about like death and the afterlife. Can you talk about that at all, or has your research sort of touched on that?
Yeah, like I said, I kind of break my main question into three categories of I'm investigating or trying to reconstruct funerary customs, values, and beliefs. And they're in that order for a reason, because obviously faced with archaeological material, customs is going to be the most tangible that we can reconstruct, because it's much more easy to see what they were doing because we have the material evidence. From those customs, then I infer the values. And I wish I could say from those values I would infer the beliefs, but that's not the case, because belief is a very loaded word in Roman funerary studies. We had some early scholars who um, let's say, they brought Christianizing views, so views from their own religion or their own contemporary sociocultural context into their scholarly work. So they projected a lot of notions of belief in an afterlife onto Roman evidence that simply is not always there. Sometimes it may well very be there, but a lot of the time it wasn't, and this has made a lot of scholars subsequently or consequently very cautious of inferring beliefs. Um, I'm I take more of a middle ground view, so I'm definitely open to investigating beliefs. I don't want to shut it down altogether, because we do have evidence from some funerary monuments that people at least valued a belief. So it's very difficult to say that someone actually believes in something, because I think a lot of the time, if you just look at our society, like a lot of people don't always know what they believe in. Faith is a very difficult thing to keep constant, and a lot of people struggle with it. But then we have other groups of people in Greco-Roman society that strongly, adamantly believed in an afterlife, and they were part of these mystery cults that promised them a ritual afterlife. Most of the deceased go to Hades or the underworld, and then a select few heroes and great leaders, many who were heroized, are promised eternal blissful life in the Elysian fields or Elysium. But that's definitely difficult. Turning to my evidence, I would say a lot of my sarcophagi don't really let me interpret any beliefs in an afterlife. I have one of the most common types of inscription messages I have on my sarcophagi. It's in Greek in original, but it says to the deceased to take courage or have strength. No one is immortal. So that's quite a grounded message, that is also comforting, because it's telling the reader, it's symbolically telling the dead, but it's also telling the living reader that we're all in this together. Our fate is universal, and that they're accepting that. And that sort of message was used by pagans, Christians, and Jews. I have a few inscriptions that definitely reflect Christian beliefs, and I think some of those people, or many of those people, definitely would have seen, death as in a positive light. So they are being reunited with God and Christ. Christianity was looking very different at this time in the 4th through the 7th century AD in Phoenicia. So we have some common inscription formulae that refer to God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. But then you have some amulets from inside the sarcophagi that show Christians worshipping different gods. So there were multiple Christian gods that they were worshipping. Some of them were also invoking pagan gods, Egyptian gods, to do their bidding, to look after the deceased. So religion and belief, for some people, looked very different back then. One sort of related to beliefs is my research on lead coffins, but maybe we can talk about that later. From one sarcophagus, it's obviously not representative. It's what we would call a deviant burial. But I've got this massive iron ring, which measures about 31 centimeters in diameter and weighs 1.5 kilograms. And of course, I don't know exactly what it was used for. Maybe it had some sort of textile or wood adhered to it, and it was symbolic or something, but I'm hypothesizing that it was to weigh down a bad person, and that they were feared. I don't know how big the person was, but it was put around their neck or around their leg or something, and that they obviously didn't want this spirit, this malignant spirit, whether it was a bad person or they just had, they died in a very suspicious manner, and then people feared it. I don't know. I'd say at the moment, I hope by the end of my thesis I can say a lot more about belief. Um, Based on my iconographic evidence at the moment, I would say one thing. Um, when we visited Lebanon, so I was lucky enough to go to Lebanon, thanks to my supervisor in May 2023, before all the trouble started out there. I noticed a common motif, and I'm noticing it more when I'm collecting my data now, is the image of Psyche, the goddess who represents, the Greek goddess who represents the soul. And she's got her little butterfly wings on her back. And she appears on sarcophagi in Lebanon, but various different types of funerary monuments, sometimes painted on the tombs. And there's also one sarcophagus in my data set, also in Lebanon. I saw it. And none of the scholars in the scholarship had mentioned this, and I didn't know until I was able to take a good picture in person. But there's a fragmented butterfly on the sarcophagus. And there's also another funerary monument from Lebanon with a butterfly. And some philosophers, Roman philosophers, write about how the soul transforms into a butterfly and it flies away. If the dead is experiencing a good death and a good afterlife. And as I said, Psyche has butterfly wings. I've never, I don't know what the statistics are from Rome, but I'm quite struck by the prevalence of the butterfly and Psyche in Lebanon, because the material is obviously a much smaller number than Rome. And I have been thinking if this reflects, maybe different beliefs, because we are so far east. It has, it was conquered by the Greeks, the Persians, and usually when we're talking about beliefs in an afterlife, it's rooted in Eastern culture, in the Greek East and Roman East. So I think that's definitely possible, and I hope that will feature in my thesis and I can flesh that out. But like I said, most of the time we just have to infer that we have to infer beliefs in death rather than an afterlife, and that obviously treating the body and treating the dead was very important, of course, in Phoenicia.
I think it's interesting what you were saying there in the beginning about how, like you can say as a whole, like, what Roman society should have believed in, or like the classical, like myths and religious stories that you hear about, like Greek gods and Roman gods and all of that. But it's interesting when you think about it, like on an individual level. Like, did individuals actually believe this, especially individuals on the outskirts of the empire who have traditionally maybe had alternate beliefs and still hold on to some of those beliefs? So it is interesting as well to think about, like, on an individual level, did people believe? And then also, like, in Phoenicia, were their beliefs different because of, just their tradition, or, just the culture that sort of came before them as well?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I should also say that, well, if you just look at our Greek and Roman philosophical sources, that even the philosophers, they have a wide range of views. And a lot of it, I think, really comes down to the individual. And individuals can use the same symbol or motif, and it can mean completely different things for people. In some cases. Also, a lot of scholars are a lot more happy in Roman sarcophagi studies, saying that certain imagery or inscription may not reflect an actual belief in an afterlife, but it can reflect a euphemistic hope for an afterlife. So it's just a much more positive image that can bring the deceased peace of mind and also the mourner peace of mind.
So I know you were saying that when it comes to the butterflies, you don't know, how often they're appearing in Roman specific sarcophagi versus Phoenician sarcophagi. But so far in your research, have you noticed any major differences between Phoenician sarcophagi and Roman or Greek ones?
That's something that I'll be working on till the end of my thesis, and because there are just so many sarcophagi. So some scholars have given a number of about 20,000 from across the empire. So it's difficult to have an in-depth knowledge of all of them. And then you have to, it's not just a brief glance at them when you can start seeing these differences. At least for me, it requires a really in-depth examination. It's a little bit complicated terminology-wise because, for instance, amongst my 1,500 sarcophagi, I have 3 or 4 that are produced in Rome and shipped to Phoenicia. So we may expect those 3 or 4 to be very similar or representative to patterns that were staying in Rome with their sarcophagi. And then I have about 20 that were shipped in from Greece. So they're very typical of what the Greek sculptors were producing in Greece. And then most of my imported ones come from Turkey. And then the vast majority of my sarcophagi are made locally. So I guess, not that I ever wanted to keep this view, it's a view to always be challenged, but I guess I came into the data set not knowing what to expect and thinking I'm going to see Phoenician sculptors working Phoenician stone, imitating or emulating what's going on in Rome, and what's going on further west of Phoenicia. And this is true in some cases. So there are some garland sarcophagi, we call them half-fabricated or unfinished garland sarcophagi. So they're sarcophagi that have this vegetative garland decorating them on the chest, but they're not, well, technically they're not fully finished because it's just a vague outline of a garland that has no details to it. So it looks very abstract. And it represents an intermediary stage of the carving process. So you could half finish it and then it could be shipped somewhere and finished locally. But for whatever reason, would require a lengthy answer. For many reasons, they were never finished and it became a status symbol. It became a status symbol associated with imported material, which is prestigious. So this is something that locals copy. So instead of some local sarcophagi copying the finished garland sarcophagi that were being imported, they start copying this half-finished one, which is really interesting because it shows you how values were changing, not necessarily just in Phoenicia, but elsewhere in the empire as well. The next point is also concerning the finished garland sarcophagi because they're very common in my data set. The imported garland sarcophagi, they can be decorated with garlands on 3 or 4 sides of the chest. So a lot of expenditure invested there. But what I've noticed with my locally produced sarcophagi in Phoenicia is a lot of them will only have a garland on one short side, maybe also a long side. And it might seem insignificant at first, but it's really interesting. So first we could frame that as an abbreviation of the full garland. So it's a much more affordable motif to have. It's only decorating one side. And because this garland design just repeats itself, you can have it on one side and it means the exact same thing as the full one, because on the long sides it's just going to be the same garland 3 times. But when you approach these locally produced sarcophagi in context, you see a different pattern. And that's in one of the main cemeteries in Phoenicia or Lebanon. Many of the sarcophagi are arranged in rows, and it's their long sides that are next to each other. So a lot of the long sides are hidden from view at some point. Maybe, like I said, when they were first erected, they were visible on all sides, but eventually the long sides become hidden. So I was questioning, how much is it the spatial organization or the lack of space dictating commissioners to request only a garland on the short side that would be visible, or how much of it is it this preconceived value in only having a decoration on a short side that then leads to this arrangement of the sarcophagi in rows? And it's not just garlands that you see appearing on the short sides. Many of the portraits on imported sarcophagi are on the long sides. When you look at the locally produced ones, the portraits are on the short sides. And there's a distinct, unique, so I guess this is the best example of Phoenicia being different. A distinction in Phoenician sarcophagi, which is an altar. So many Roman sarcophagi across the empire may have a low relief altar, so an altar that isn't protruding very much on the sarcophagus surface. But in Phoenicia, they have these altars that are protruding like quite a sizable amount, so like 10 or 15 centimeters even. And these are functional altars, and I haven't come across these anywhere else in that empire. So some of them have little hollows inside. In one, we found a lamp, and in other ones, there are scorch marks. So it's direct evidence of ritual activity, not just being practiced at the sarcophagi, but in or on the sarcophagi. And these, again, are always on the short sides. So this really changes how ancient people would have experienced the sarcophagi. Instead of standing, bending down, kneeling, or sitting at the long sides, their activity, I would theorize, if they want to interact with the iconography, and if the iconography and altars are that important to people, that's where that ritual activity would be concentrated. And with this observation, I question how this changes how you're interacting with the corpse, or how it reflects values of the corpse. So in Roman funerary studies, the head is the criterion for a sacred space, a locus religiosus. So you can have a body, you can lack the body, you don't have the body of the corpse, you can have a head, and that tomb is then sacred. So that's all that matters. So I'm wondering if we would potentially see any patterns between the decoration on one short side and the head. Is the head on the other side? Is the head on the other side of that altar? Which would really make ritual activity more potent if it's being directed towards not just the corpse in general, but the head. This is something, unfortunately, again, we don't have the osteological evidence. So I have many bone remains from my sarcophagi, but a lot of them at the moment, unfortunately, have just been chucked in or are sitting on a shelf, and we don't know always the distribution of the skulls. I've tried to, where I can, identify where the skulls were distributed in the sarcophagi, and if this related to the decoration or the spatial organization. But apart from it, in a few cases, it's very difficult. There are lots of other ways I could say the sarcophagi are different from Rome, but they're such minute details that I think they would be lost on a lot of people. But it's very difficult. It's a very important question. How much do the sarcophagi of Phoenicia reflect this empire-wide trend or fashion versus local values and beliefs? And it's very difficult because they're importing this material in some cases. And I've already talked about how some sarcophagi can be quite generically decorated as well. And the problem with generic decoration is it doesn't negate personal or sentimental value. So that becomes very difficult to identify as well. And I've also only collected data from one of my sites so far. So I think when I collect the rest of the data, I will find more evidence. There is one other point, which is related to garland sarcophagi. They are like the most simplistic decorative type, and they're actually a lot more interesting than they seem. So the garland motif is really popular on Roman sarcophagi and Roman tombs in general. It alludes to vegetative offerings that were given to heroes and leading citizens and athletes. So it celebrates, it honors the dead, and obviously alludes to real vegetative offerings that were given to the dead at the tombside. So it's found everywhere on sarcophagi in the Roman Empire, but you have a distinct one. So its appearance and its style is distinct in this city called Sidon, or modern Sidon in Lebanon. And the garland hangs from two lion heads, one at either side, and the lion head has a ring in its mouth. So it looks like the garland is hanging from the rings. And I've wanted to expand my study of stone sarcophagi to incorporate lead, terracotta, and wood, because I think it's really important. It will give a more representative view of society, because it wasn't just the wealthiest people who could afford a stone sarcophagus, but people who could afford the cheaper materials most of the time as well. And by taking this approach, I've been able to see a pattern, which is often the wooden sarcophagi don't preserve well enough, so we just have bronze or iron nails and rings and appliques, so designs that were attached to the wood. And a common one are these rings, or you also have these bronze or iron lion heads, again with the rings in their mouths, that come from wooden sarcophagi. And this is really interesting because it means that on the wooden sarcophagi you would have had these rings that were actually functional, unlike on the stone ones. So it would have allowed people to carry and maneuver the sarcophagi, but you could also suspend the real garlands from the rings. So it means that when they've assimilated that design into the stone sarcophagi and the lead sarcophagi, the rings are obviously no longer functional, but they've also assimilated the motif of the garland hanging from them. And this is interesting because it would also challenge a traditional assumption that it's of the trickle-down theory, right? That culture and material and visual culture is consumed by the elite or the upper classes, and it trickles down in society, and lower classes start emulating them. But it's very plausible that the people commissioning the wooden sarcophagi were of a lower socioeconomic class than the patrons of the stone sarcophagi. And this tradition of the bronze heads on the wooden sarcophagi also dates back to a pre-Roman period. So this is one example of how Sidon is probably my best shot at highlighting the local actually influencing the Roman in a way, and reversing that source of influence.
So are lead coffins then, or lead sarcophagi, would they then have been less expensive than the stone sarcophagi?
That's a good question, and one that I think the answer is yes. I've tried, I wish I could just magically come up with the prices of these objects, which I can't. I've looked at that.
Just somebody publish a price list, please.
Like why wasn't there this ancient nerd in ancient times who loved sarcophagi as much as I did, and he was just writing about them all the time? So I've looked at the Edict of Diocletian. So it lists all the prices of all these random materials. Unfortunately, the lead is fragmented, so I don't know how much the lead cost.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think they would have been much cheaper than the stone sarcophagi, because I don't know how much, but much cheaper, because although lead required some labor and skill, the lead is pretty fragile in terms of it's very unlikely that you would have carried the corpse in the lead coffin without some sort of support structure. So maybe like a wooden plank or bier of some sort. Many of the lead coffins in my data set are ornately decorated, so they have lovely designs, but they're made with molds, so it didn't require the same amount of skill. Obviously, the stone sarcophagi don't even have to be ornately decorated to be expensive. I mean, the sheer mass of the stone and the labor to carve the stone into that shape and ship it just doesn't compare to the lead coffins. So in terms of expenditure, they are much more expensive. But does that necessarily mean that the patrons of the lead coffins were definitely of a lower socioeconomic class? No, because for whatever reason, they may have just preferred a lead coffin. It may have been a family custom. Lead coffins, most of our lead coffins come from Phoenicia in the Roman Empire. So you have about 111 from Britain. yeah, I know of random ones from Gaul and Portugal and Italy, but most of them come from Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Syria. So that's where the initiation, I think, comes from. So it was a very Phoenician thing to do. So this may have appealed to some people. It seems the lead coffin production took off at a similar time to the sarcophagi, so I'm not sure if one was influencing the other. Their iconographic programs are very different as well. Yeah, but that's always a question. How much does death reflect real life? Can we infer someone's wealth from their tomb? Because a lot of people would, in a way, spend a lot more money on their tomb than they actually had, because they would save it. Or they thought, well, why wouldn't I spend it all now because I'm dead, or I'll never see my loved one again, so this is the best thing I can do for them. Then you have, I think of one inscription from Pompeii that I remember. A man commissioned his epitaph on his tomb to say something like, "Oh, I've chosen this sort of tomb because I'm a humble person, and it's not like the best tomb I could have chosen." So that's difficult. Obviously, I can say that the stone sarcophagi were a lot more expensive, and in most cases, I would expect wealthier patrons to commission the stone, followed by the lead, the terracotta, the wood, but there are always going to be exceptions to that, and I'm still figuring out how I will approach that in my thesis.
So, given that they could use mold for lead coffins as well, you might not be able to answer this, that's fine.
Okay.
It just dawned on me, but would it be more likely then that lead coffins to be like the same motif to be mass produced if you can just take a mold of it versus having to actually carve the stone?
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, with the stone sarcophagi, we would have had workshops across the empire using copybooks, like all artists in the Greco-Roman world would have been using copybooks, with these stock or standardized images of figures and scenes and symbols that you could basically just copy and paste. You could show to potential clients when they visited your workshop, and you could pick and choose parts and combine them in whatever way you wanted. And then there are always, as I mentioned, ways to personalize things. In some cases, maybe you come up with your own design as well. With the lead coffins, yes, you're right. So you're just using molds. So in a way, the lead coffins are a lot more standardized and generic. You see the same motif popping up all the time. The same mold is not used every time, so sometimes in very tiny details you can see variation, like they will alter the exact shapes of the leaves on different molds to look slightly different. So you have to take that into account when you're trying to quantify the expense of the product. But you see the same sorts of motifs occurring, which are a vegetation, symbols related to the god Dionysus, but rarely himself. Gorgon heads are very popular, so like the heads of Medusa who could petrify people, turn them to stone. Sphinxes are also very common, and rope motifs or bondage motifs. And I've actually argued in a paper that I'm hoping to publish. Well, I will be publishing it, but when, I don't know. That's what I hope about, that it was relatively soon. That it's not just... we shouldn't just read these replications as a result of the standardized molding, but it actually, I argue, reflects a belief or a hope for a sort of supernatural power or a special magical power of these lead coffins. So lead in the Greco-Roman world was believed to have special properties. It was used as a thin tablet to write these curses on, curse tablets. So you would write curses. There's one I remember from my undergrad where someone was bathing in the Roman baths and someone stole their clothes. So they started damning this person in a lead tablet and asked the gods to, I don't know, wreak some havoc on them or ruin their lives. And then you would try to bury these tablets in places that would enhance the power. So first of all, if you bury it, then it enhances the power. You could deposit it in graves, in sanctuaries, in baths. We also have Pliny the Elder again, talking about the special properties of lead, how they could strengthen the body and the voice in particular. So the Romans were clearly not aware of the fact that in some cases their lead pipes were leading to the poisoning that we're now aware of. So they thought that it had special properties, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So I don't know exactly which one people believed in for the case of the lead coffins, but that's the first point in my argument, that lead has special properties. And the next one is the iconography. So I already mentioned the rope and the bondage motifs, and this harks back to an earlier practice in Lebanon and Israel of using real rope to bind these coffins even more secure and shut. And now it's been visualized in the lead moldings. The Gorgon I mentioned and the Sphinx have a long history of serving as protectors of tombs, warding off evil. So I'm arguing that this imagery was all about enforcing boundaries between the living and the dead. Firstly, it could have protected the dead against violation, unwanted reuse, because of course these lead coffins are much more easily penetrable than the stone coffins, because it's much easier to break open the seal of the lid than the heavy stone ones. But then also I questioned, okay, how much could these special lead properties and imagery also be operating beyond the mortal plane? Could they be protecting the dead from some sort of evil spirit? I've already mentioned that this is a context in which people were practicing magic and believed in lots of things that they were not believing in Rome. But in Rome, even we have the manes, the spirits of the dead that you are meant to appease and give offerings to. You have the festival of the Lemuria, where you have the Lemures or the larvae, the evil spirits of the dead. So I've also questioned, okay, was it also maybe about protecting the living from the dead as well? And then the third element that I looked at was the context. So lead, terracotta, and wooden coffins. I should say that right now I'm using the term sarcophagus and coffin interchangeably. In my thesis, I go into a lot of detail about why we shouldn't do that in all cases, but listeners can just take them as the same thing right now. But the lead, the terracotta, and the wood are different from stone in their display contexts. They're never open air above ground because they can't function like stone sarcophagi. They can't protect the dead in the same practical way. They can be easy to break. People would have known that often we find terracotta sarcophagi and they're just in fragments. Unfortunately, the wood, of course, is not going to is going to perish. It won't last long. So the lead, the terracotta, and the wood are always either inside one another and underground, or inside a stone sarcophagus, or inside some sort of niche in a wall, so they're sealed off. So it was also this context that got me very interested in the lead coffins, because why spend all that money, and not just money, but like personal investment in the value of the symbolic value of the imagery if you're just going to hide it. I've hypothesized that it would have been seen during the funeral, it was seen by loved ones, but then once you bury the person in this lead coffin, when is anyone ever going to see that imagery again? And what is the point in the design? So if a violator or an unwanted reuser digs up this coffin or takes it out, they're going to be faced straight away with a gorgon or a sphinx, especially if it's in a dark area. So I already said they're going to be underground. If you're using a torch or a lamp, it's going to be quite a sudden face-to-face contact that you have with this gorgon, and with that experience, be even more terrifying. or try to ward you off. So I think, some of the context, or the design for those coffins, can be put down to what we would call conspicuous consumption. So you can spend so much money on something, and then the very fact that you're hiding it shows off your wealth because you have money to throw away, basically. But I've also argued that there was a symbolic power to these coffins in many ways, and that they could still be operating even if they're not seen for the living, because they could embody the power of a Gorgon and a Sphinx that is still going to be operating even if the living aren't seeing them all the time. And if they are also operating towards or against spirits, the context doesn't even matter. I mean, you could argue that in terms of the lead coffins that are buried, you could again argue that the context enhances the power, because I already mentioned people would bury cursed tablets to enhance the special properties of the lead.
Yeah, it makes you wonder almost if there's something about the act of burying it that gives it extra power.
Yeah.
At the very least, it makes the Gorgon head scarier when you see it in the dark with a torch only. So you were saying that sometimes these lead coffins would then, or sarcophagi, would then be placed in a stone one. If the lead one was decorated, would the stone one then also be decorated, or would that be plain?
The stone one could be decorated. So I don't really have a large amount of those cases, because sometimes the lead is inside a terracotta. Terracotta ones can be painted, but the paint doesn't always survive. The cases in which I do have lead inside stone, I believe that the stone ones are decorated, yes. So if they belong to the same person, they would have spent even more money on the two of those coffins. And it's definitely an interesting pairing of interfaces. So you've got this lead coffin that you would think is more for the dead at that point, and then the outer decoration on the stone sarcophagus is perhaps more for the living, because that's what they see all the time.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, if you pay to have your lead sarcophagus decorated and then also pay to have your stone sarcophagus decorated. It's interesting that you're putting one inside the other. One can't be seen anymore, the other can.
Yeah, and did both definitely date to the same time? Like, they could have been for the same person, but as I mentioned before, you could be buried rather quickly in the lead coffin, and then perhaps it took a bit longer to finish the stone one, and then they could be placed into that later.
So this is all very fascinating, and I find it very interesting. I could talk about this forever. I always
So
find
could I.
funerary practices so interesting. Like any time period, I always want to know, what are you doing with your dead? But as someone who is researching this, why do you think it is important that people kind of look into these funerary practices?
Well, I think I would probably just raise a couple of points that I've already touched upon, which is death is universal, and to a degree, so are the responses that we have to death. Some sort of emotional response is going to be universal across societies and cultures, across times. Although the way that may manifest through a mourning process is going to vary by society and culture. I think that it provides some of the richest evidence for archaeologists and for scholars of history and anthropology, despite the fact that I've already said that it can be difficult sometimes to tell how much death is really a mirror of life. I've told my students, because this is a big statement that we use all the time, and I've said that I think death is, or at least death in our archaeological record, is one of those crazy mirrors in a funhouse. It's going to distort everything. And you still see the picture, but you're not really quite sure what's true anymore. And then the last thing I would raise is that it goes back to what got me interested in sarcophagi iconographies in the first place, which is, when else in studying the ancient world do we get the opportunity to interact with such an intimate part of human experience? Just the material record, the process of death and grieving, and then visiting tombs over time is so intimate, so emotional. I just think it's the ideal, way to understand the ancient world, and also, um, with a growing movement towards ethical concerns and care for the dead in archaeology, and also more theoretical studies of emotions in the ancient world and lived experiences. I just think it's a really important way of bridging that gap between our ancestors and us as well. We see many similarities between the two.
As someone who takes an interest in rebuilding like individuals' lived experiences, I do it through an osteological point of view, but I do have to take funerary stuff into consideration. So it is a field that I try and kind of gain more experience or more knowledge in, but I'm always learning new things and new ways people interpret things and stuff like that. So it's been really interesting to talk to you about this. So, is there anything that I haven't touched on or asked you about that you feel is really important or that people should know about your work?
Uh, Probably not. I mean, like I said, I could also just be on here for ages and just endlessly talking about my thesis. Although I should probably publish some things first. But I've really enjoyed all your questions. They were really interesting. And you really did your research, so thank you.
Thank you.
I was like, like some of your questions, I was like, oh, did I do this thing? Yeah, I did. Yeah, and your question on, um, I guess like what a funeral would look like in Phoenicia, or what the funerary practices in Phoenicia has been really helpful for my research as well, and thinking about how I want to bring that into my thesis. So thank you very much.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an amazing conversation. It's been great to have you.
Thank you.
Right. And thank you to the listeners for listening in. Is there anywhere that you want to promote, anywhere like you have a website or anything like that, where anyone can like follow up if they want to learn more about your project and the work that you're doing?
Well, I'm not sure how to convey that in this format. I mean, obviously, I have social media. I use social media somewhat willingly. LinkedIn,
I can
Instagram.
link it all. Yeah,
You
I can
can,
link it all
you
below.
can link. Yeah. I'll send you all my information.
Okay, great. So if anyone's interested, it'll all be linked in the description below somewhere. So thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you all next week. And thank you for Nicholas for being on.